My name is Kathryn Nwajako, and I am a Nigerian Brit, born in Scotland, raised in London, living in Paris. I lived in Senegal between the years 1997 and 2000, and I have been going regularly back to Senegal since that time, at least once every year, once every other year. What makes Senegal stand out for me is it's quite difficult to capture. I'll describe the feeling. So when I used to live in Senegal, I would travel across the region and often be returning back home to Senegal. And I would be on an Air Afrique flight, which doesn't exist anymore. And as we would land, they would put on this music by an artist called Kumba Gawlo Seck, who's still an artist, a singer. And she would start singing, and we would start landing, and I would have goose pimples all over my body. I have never felt so at home in an adopted home anywhere else in the world. I've lived in London, I've lived in Paris, I've lived in Nigeria, but the goose pimply feeling that I felt and still feel when I arrive in Dakar is something I've never felt anywhere else. So it's a very deep, welcoming feeling. And it's so strong because it's not my country. I lived there only really properly for 3 years and have always felt this sense of coming home, a warmth. Senegal is not, compared to East Africa, lush, green, not in Dakar at least, is sandy, is very bright. There's not that much shade from the sunlight. And it's quite flat, apart from two mounds, at various parts of the city. So it's actually quite flat. But I think it's the people and the vibrancy of their color, the color they dress themselves with, the regalness with which they carry themselves, and their beauty that makes Senegal so charming and so enticing and so unlike any other place I've lived in. And you don't have to go very far to see the beauty. I mean, you turn your head and you see it's either in the walk of somebody or the way they carry their boubou, or the deep shade of blue in against a sandy beige that is just stunning. So, you know, Senegal, for those reasons, I'm talking about Dakar, but there are greener parts of Senegal, and it depends on when you go. In the summer, in the hivernage, what they call hivernage, it can be very lush green actually. My favorite thing to do in Senegal, and it sounds a little bit typical because I'm sure I'm not the only one saying this is a favorite thing to do, is to walk along the Corniche. They have a beachfront called La Corniche, and that beachfront is incredible because you have access to it. It's quite rare in West Africa, many parts of West Africa, to have very easy access to the sea. And Senegal is the westernmost point of Africa. And of course, the Corniche over the last 20 years or so has been more and more built up. So you don't have as much access as you used to have, but it's still pretty good. I mean, I walked along the Corniche for a good hour at Christmas without having to change routes. And what's really exciting is that not only do you have the Atlantic Ocean next to you, but you also, at certain times of day, either in the morning or at dusk, just after dusk, you see Senegalese of all ages, men, women, young men in particular, training. They train, they jog, they walk, they're doing all sorts of things. I mean, the thing that struck me most on my last visit was I was jogging in the morning, or kind of walking, jogging, and I saw these guys training on the sand, and they had tires, huge tires, tied to a rope which was tied to their waist, and they were walking backwards. This was their training, so they were carrying a huge weight on their waists and walking back, and then they would turn around when they got to the end, and they would walk back the other way, backwards. And what struck me was the ingenuity of this as a training method, but also this kind of invincibility that Senegalese men carry. You know, it's like nothing is beyond them, nothing is beyond their imaginations. They can turn anything into everything. And it gives me such joy and hope, to see that, because in it, it's like, Africa's own resilient soul. You throw anything at me and I'll turn it into something, and I'll actually even make a training exercise out of it. And, it is the ingenuity, the inventiveness, and the overcoming all odds that I so love about Africa in general, but in particular in Senegal, because it's done in such a stylish way. In a number of ways, and I have to specify, that Senegal, the part of it that I know best, Dakar and its surroundings, is part of the Sahel. And I'm, as I said, from Nigeria, but the part of Nigeria I come from is the southeast, which is forest. There are forest parts of Senegal, so Casamance is probably more similar in cultural form to my own culture. So, for example, there's a food called supu kanja, and supu kanja, which I have made in my own way, is actually like okra soup, in fact. Okra being an Igbo word, I would have also mentioned, but it's like okra soup, and that comes from Casamance. Anyway, that aside, I would say that one of the things that struck me the most in terms of comparing, because of course you always compare to what you know, was that when I first went to live in Senegal, I was my only experience of Africa really as a lived experience was Nigeria, and so I would go to Nigeria as my father's daughter, and or I would travel. Eventually, I went to travel around Nigeria for work, and Nigeria had lived through military regimes, and as a result, Nigerians tend, my experience of Nigeria, they tend to socialize indoors. They socialize indoors and in very circumscribed spaces, either religious ones or maybe not so religious ones, but they're indoors and they're protected. Nigerians have gates that are very high with guards often armed outside their front entrances. Senegal is very different, very different. People live outside. They live a lot outside. And by that, I mean they party outside. And so one of the things that struck me was that, you'd always find, for wedding ceremonies or christenings or whatever, people would commandeer their whole street and put up canopy. And that's very fine. I mean, I think the local authorities are trying to push back against it, but it's really fine. And so you always hear something going on in the street, music. You always hear music. You hear the muezzin, which is the call to prayer generally, because Muslim, predominantly Muslim country, and Muslim with a difference, in that, you have a very, yes, you have a lot of conservative Islam that has grown, has developed a lot, most in the last 10-15 years, but you also have a great deal of religious tolerance, so there are 4 brotherhoods. The Murid is probably known best, you also have the Tijan brotherhood, and they're very important in the social organization of Islamic observance in Senegal. But you have a predominantly Muslim country, but you also have a very sexually what's the word? Not very prudish country. So the thing I was really struck by when I first arrived in Senegal was you know, they call jump back out, which is like crop top, and which has always been the source of a lot of conversation. You like it, you don't like it, but till today, even though you've got like a move, a kind of a growth in Islamic conservatism, and more and more women veiling and so on, you still have lots of young people in very revealing attire, and that's also accepted. And my friends would often tell me stories about the nightlife in Senegal. It always starts very late, so people don't even think of going out before 11 at night, and then go on till 4 or 5 in the morning, and they'd recount to me how they would be coming back from a club, and they'd on their way they would see their neighbor going to the mosque, and that was just like the two lives of the multiple lives that Senegalese live. So I really relished that sociability, that outside sociability that you can participate in. Not that you're invited to every wedding or baptism ceremony or naming ceremony, but you'd hear it. You'd have to walk past these spaces, and I really loved that, because I think that ownership of the public space is something that countries that have been at war or had military regimes can't ever take for granted. And of course, Senegal has had its Casamance War that lasted for a long time. They want to, be rosy-eyed about it, but they haven't known what military rule is. It's the longest country with the longest uh, history of democratic rule, long before the wave of democratization in the rest of West Africa. Senegal prides itself as having had a long history. So, and these things matter, because, they dictate and determine how free people can feel in their bodies, in their occupation of spaces, and their ability to welcome outsiders. Senegal kind of prides itself on being the on having tiranga. They call it tiranga, which means to welcome, and it's really true. I mean, it's not fake. Senegalese are really welcoming, and I love them for that. They really welcomed me, and they have a very, very privileged place in my heart. I lived and worked there, so I was able to have relationships with my colleagues, and that was like a long time ago. It's like 25 years ago. Until this day, I still have those relationships with those colleagues. I went to dinner with one of them, not one of them, but their daughter, because they weren't available when I was there. So that's very beautiful. And also, I didn't speak Wolof, and Wolof is really the main language in Senegal. Um, it's not the official language in that it's not taught at school, it's not used, but really it's the language that everyone speaks. And I tried, so I could do the greetings and the necessary, but even without Wolof, I was still welcomed. I spoke French, so that made it easier. But even people, I know someone who's a Nigerian who doesn't speak French or Wolof, and he's still very, very welcomed. So, I mean, there is something else. I would say though that I'm very aware that the way I enjoy Senegal as an outsider is related to the fact that I am an outsider. So I don't necessarily have to conform to the strictures that would be expected of a woman living in Senegal who is Senegalese. I take a lot of comfort in the freedom that I enjoy, but I also am very aware it's because I'm not a daughter of the country. So because I can say that because I know my Senegalese women friends have a much more challenging, turbulent relationship with what it means to be Senegalese and the obligations and expectations that are thrust upon you. So, but as a tourist, as an African tourist, it's pretty good going. And having experienced Nigeria, my country, um, I can say that with confidence because Nigeria is amazing for its size, the possibilities that size creates for an imagination, you know, scale, big dreams, fantastic. But at the same time, Nigeria is a very difficult environment to live in a peaceful way in. So, and Nigerians experience that through their bodies and through their ability to occupy or not occupy spaces. And, you know, it's no surprise that Nigerians have very high blood pressure. And not that Senegalese don't, so let me not romanticize, but the kind of stressful existence that is your daily experience in many parts of Nigeria, I have not experienced such in Senegal. And that is not to say that Senegalese themselves are not feeling harassed by the cost of living, by the challenges that a bustling, fast developing city creates for people who can't afford the pace or the basic cost of that life. So I'm not naive, because to compare is to be able to have the mobility that my situation allows. So constantly, Senegal is opening my eyes to different parts of my character. When I first arrived in Senegal as a young Londoner from Nigeria who had a lot of privilege, I was very impatient. I was very impatient by the length of time it took to do things, by logistical problems, my car, things never being clear cut, you know, like there was no fixed price, having to bargain for everything. And I saw and slowly I adjusted. So I was having less and less arguments with people about time and things. And so my expectations were changing, and I was also relaxing into a different mode. It's not that it's all resolved. I'm still not the most patient person, but I did learn to kind of put a lid on it. However, there is one thing that I did and continue to be challenged by in Senegal, and is taxis. Taxis and change is a real problem. So I've had lots of, how do you call them, altercations with taxi drivers about not having enough change, not having the change, right? So I come in with a note and they don't have change. And now, of course, everyone is paying for everything on the app. So there's an app called Yango. And if you don't have it, or if you don't have enough credit on your phone so that it's active, you're in trouble. So there was a situation whilst I was there recently where, like, I had the money. In fact, I had the money, but the guy didn't have change. And so, huge argument. I don't have any change. Get down out of my car. Go get. And then that's when I start to feel out of my depth. Like, okay, how will this situation resolve itself? I have no idea. So you just have to be hopeful that it will resolve. So in that particular situation, the taxi driver who left his key in the ignition went and started looking for change, and then cursed me a bit, came back and gave me my change. Yeah, it was the funny little things like that. I've also really enjoyed or learnt. I think Senegal has really awakened my love of color. You know, I have a real sensitivity to color, and you know, Senegal has allowed me to see you know, in colors in contrast. So when I was constantly just like taking pictures of everything. If I could, it was almost like it gave me a hypersensitivity to color. And Senegal is also a place of very vibrant artistic production, and so not just through my observation in the street, but then being able to be exposed to um, artists' works in galleries and so on. Senegal is also a place where I learned to allow myself to write. I wrote my first creatively published, I've published boring things, but creative piece when I was living in Senegal. It was an edited volume a very long time ago, so it's ages ago. And I also was given some space in a place called the Raw Material Company, lovely kind of arts and culture education centre, also residency for artists. I was just given space there to pull together a collection of poetry that I was struggling with, but to finalise it. So Senegal's given me like the opportunity to test things out, to become something else, to be what I want to be, which is just a real gift. I went to Senegal with the idea that I was going to get, I went on holiday with my family and then I let them all go back and I decided I gifted myself a week extra. And that week extra was to be able to make some progress on something I'm working on, a novel. And I rented out, I booked myself into a hotel. I had to lie to my friends that I was in a hotel because they would never accepted, because I was staying with them before, never accepted that I come to Senegal and stay in a hotel. I had to lie to them and booked myself in this hotel. And then the idea, and the other day I was looking at my plan, the idea that was I was going to write all day, take a few breaks, go to the Corniche, walk a bit, write all day. And this hotel was a nice boutique hotel, not too far from the Corniche, but the room was quite dark. And I was like, this is a bit weird. So I was like, when I was writing, I'd had the room wide open to let some shaft of light. I was like, this was not the ideal, I'm going to come to a hotel, right? But I was writing, I was doing it, but it felt quite oppressive. And it also felt like work. Like, I was like, okay, so how is this different to me being in my house, wherever it is that I live? So for 2 days, I carried on like that. I was writing, I was quite diligent. And I was like, you know what? I have to go out. So I allowed myself the luxury of just like saying, okay, I will progress the writing, but there is no way I can come to Dakar and can't really immerse myself in the vibrancy of this town. And so what I did was that I would go out and then start to be a bit free myself up. It was almost like I felt like I was like a goat. There are many goats that hang around Dakar, tethered, you know, tethered, and then suddenly someone comes along and untethers the goat, and the goat is still standing for quite some time in the same spot to which it was tethered. And then suddenly realized, oh, but I can be free, I can roam around. So I felt like that untethered goat that suddenly realized that it could roam around. And I also allowed myself to just have another kind of notebook where I was just writing, free writing, poetry on anything that crossed my mind, on what I observed, just to, really allow myself to feel free in my creative production and to have an outlet for all the things that I was seeing, the colors, the people, the weirdnesses, and to capture that. And then to have fun, and just like, so I would swim with my friends. We used to swim there's an island called Ngor, and they used to swim from the mainland to the island as a kind of their weekend exercise jaunt. And one of those friends was also taking a long holiday. So 3 times we did this crossing back there and back in very cold waters. It was like minus 70, it was 17 or 17, no, not minus 17, 17. But that's very, very cold. and we'd swim against the waves and everything, and we did it. It was amazing. And so I started to really just like, okay, just enjoy yourself. And I was comforted by this poet I'd read and also seen a video of, who was saying, you know, everything is poetry, darling. Everything is poetry. So the whole business of observing and soaking up is all power for your, it's like creative fuel. So you can't stick yourself away in a dark room, you know, and think that you will breathe life into the creative act that you were embarked upon. So I was like, okay, I can have fun. It's okay. So I allowed myself to do that. And so I did get work done, but I also lived, which was really great. Okay, there are two. In particular, I would like to, yeah, to flag. The first one, or a few anyway. The first one was when I went to Village des Artistes, and suggested to me by a friend, Kenyan friend who's been living in Senegal for a very long time. And I, even though I'd known Senegal, I mean, I've known Dakar, I didn't know about the existence of this place. So I went there, and it's this residency for our, like a permanent residency funded by the Ministry of Culture, that contains an art gallery in the middle, but also all these workshops, like ateliers for artists, and which is like co-managed by the artists themselves. And in the exhibition space, they decide what they're going to put out there and agree on it. So what was beautiful, though, was that I went on my own as part of my I'm going to enjoy myself jaunt, and it was very deliberate, you know, because I'd been advised to go there, and I've not got the best sense of direction. So I was even glad that I was able to guide the taxi and we got to the place. And as soon as I stepped in there, I was wandering around, and I was just going into atelier of different artists and chatting with them. And it was just so, there were so many serendipitous things. It was just kind of amazing. So let me just describe one. So there was one artist, I can't remember his name now, the first one whose atelier I went into, and we were talking about his work, and he had some crazy philosophy. I can't remember the name. I'm sorry, I'm not being very precise. But anyway, it came to me in the conversation to share with him a book that I'd been reading, which is called Où s'adosse le ciel, and it's by David Diop. And I was reading it before I got to Dakar. For a long time, it takes quite a long time to read books. And I was finishing it. I just finished it, and I gave it to my sister-in-law. And what's beautiful about the book is that it ends in Saint Louis and in Dakar, in Les Mamelles, where I happen to be staying. So it's all very kind of, I read it, I finished it, and I was there. And the guy was talking to me, the artist. I said, oh, I think we were talking about Egypt, because I won't go on about the book, but Egypt and the African, you know, heritage in Egypt is a very important theme in the book. And of course, Senegal is the home of Cheikh Anta Diop, the historian who first popularized research on the idea that Egypt is a Black African heritage. Anyway, ancient Egypt. Anyway, so I said, oh, I've just read this book, David Diop, Où s'adosse le ciel. And I was like, wowing about it. He said, oh my gosh, never going to believe this. He was here yesterday. They were telling me about the book. And we were like this and that. I was like, oh my God, oh my God. So it was all encounters like that. And very beautiful ones. And so I would just go from atelier to atelier, talking to all of them, like hanging out, really looking at the art. And it was so kind of fluid. And, you know, I met an artist who would just also go into the gallery, wasn't from there, with whom also I shared stories about Koyo Kuo, who was the curator that died earlier, last year, who also lived in Dakar. She's from Cameroon, but she had made Dakar her home too. So I met an artist who said, "Oh my goodness, you remind me of Koyo." So we started talking about that. So there's lots of beautiful kind of connections. So Village des Artistes was a really great place with a gallery and artists residency, like an atelier that you can go and chat with them and see their work. So it's very kind of 3D experience. And then I also, what was the second beautiful experience? Yes, Ousmane Sow. Ousmane Sow is no longer with us, but he has a museum, which was formerly his house, which is near Ngor, I think. I can't remember where it is. Anyway, it's on the way to the airport. And it's amazing. It's a museum of all his work. Ousmane Sow did all these huge, gigantic statues, but also tiny little sculptures too. And I mention it because I went there quite a few years ago now, and I remember very vividly when I went seeing this sword that he sculpted, and on the arm of the sword there was a picture of an angel, not a picture, a sculpture of an angel diving, and with arms astride, like diving into nothingness. And it's in 2018, December, I saw that. And I remember it, and I still carry that image with me. I think I've even took a picture of it because it just reminds me of the ambition I have to jump, to dive into something else, to no safety net. And I might not have done it, but it's an aspiration. Senegal allowed me to imagine and still hold on to.